this is unexpected. I seize every opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, which is Charleston architecture. And this edifice, of course, is a fine representation of that. Why it's named for St. Stephen's? I don't know. St. Stephen the deacon was martyred in 35 AD. He was stoned to death for heresy because the early Christian doctrine was considered a heresy at the time. This is this Renaissance painting depicts him with stones around his head. That's what those are. He's the patron saint of brick masons, which is appropriate because the church was built and probably designed by a family of brick masons. He's also the patron of headaches, and I guess that's appropriate because a well-aimed stone could give you that. Oh, great. I don't know what's going on here, but my images are out of place. And that cannot be fixed at this location. So, no, just go back to it. Go back to it. Anyway, the original St. Stephen's Chapel was founded in 1822. The edifice was built 1823-24 down on Ginyard Street, and the lot was provided by this lady, Sarah Hobson Russell, who of course lived in the Russell House that's been in the news lately. And she donated the lot for the original chapel, which burned in the Great Fire of 1835. It's described in the newspaper at that time as a small brick church. And there was documentation at the time that the chapel, was becoming too small for the congregation. And so they decided to rebuild it at a more capacious location in Ansonborough. You see it in the middle of that bird's eye view there. And on the right is a blow-up of the depiction, which is our earliest depiction of the church that I know of. But it's recognizable by the stepped parapet on top of the facade there, which masks the gable end of the roof. And this, of course, is the church. The cornerstone was laid December 26, 1835, and the church was consecrated October 24, 1836, which is, in terms of Charleston buildings, is a pretty good turnaround. The cornerstone was laid by two of the Hallback brothers, who were brick masons, builders, and possibly, I think probably, they also designed this church. The brothers who were involved, who laid the cornerstone, were Henry Hallback, who you see depicted in his youth, about 1800, and his younger brother Edward Hallback. They're a rather handsome family, and that miniature portrait is still in the Hallback family. It has not migrated to some northern museum like much of our art has. There's a tradition that the bricks from the burned church were cleaned and reused for this building, and that's possibly true. But also, they needed more bricks because this building's bigger than this Ginyard Street one. And fortunately, the Holbeck family had a brickyard at Boone Hall Plantation, making this kind of brick, which is known as Charleston gray brick or Carolina gray brick. The term gray denotes the color of the clay that the bricks were fashioned from, hand fashioned. So sometimes you find finger imprints in the bricks themselves. And when they were fired, they turned this beautiful reddish brown, russet brown, brownish red, however you want to express it, which is unique to Charleston and the Low Country, and gives our buildings, I think, a softer look. But it's also a fragile brick, and so often it was stuccoed, and that's the case of this building as well. The Holbecks, among their many projects, they did the brick masonry contract for St. John's Lutheran Church. And I think possibly they attended that church, but because that was the church of the colonial German families, where the services were in English. They didn't design this church that we know of. Frederick Wessner was probably the architect of that, but you can see that this building has similarities to that church and also to other churches in Charleston, with galleries along the sides and back and an apse at the end, articulated by a giant arch. You see that a lot in Charleston churches. St. Stephen's often is identified as being in the Greek Revival style, but it's a bit more complicated than that. Everything with columns is not Greek Revival, I'm sorry to tell you. And it is true that the building has these Greek Revival columns holding up the galleries, and you see that in the middle image, one of the, it's this column in particular. How do you tell Greek Doric columns from Roman Doric columns? And the image on the right is a Roman Doric column from 47 East Bay Street. Roman Doric columns have base molding. Greek Doric columns, as you see, do not. They sit directly on the floor. So that's one way to recognize the difference. Also, the triglyph, you see over on the right the part of the portico of the Parthenon, which shows two columns with one triglyph over each column and a triglyph in the intervening space between the two columns. That was the Greek pattern for the use of triglyphs. But as you can see, the triglyphs here don't fit that pattern because they fit the Roman pattern, which became the Renaissance pattern, which became the Georgian pattern, which we all are familiar with. The Romans began setting their columns farther apart, and so it wasn't practical, didn't look right to have a one triglyph over a very wide space, and so they began using several triglyphs over the intervening spaces, but always a triglyph over a column. So here we have the Roman and Georgian pattern of triglyph use. Also, the arch is not Greek. The Romans invented the arch, and also the Greeks, ancient Greeks, did not use pilasters. The Romans developed the pilaster as sort of a flattened column against the wall with a very shallow projection. It doesn't support anything, it's merely for decoration. And the use of arches and pilasters came down from the Romans through the Renaissance, through the Georgian period, etc. And that's the effect here. Now, there's a bit of confusion when the Greek Revival period came along in American architecture, because those Greek Revival designers began using pilasters because they were so decorative, ignorant, I guess, of the fact that they weren't Greek. So here we have pilasters on the front and along the sides of the exterior of St. Stephen's, which don't have base moldings, and so technically the Greek Revival, although technically they're not even Greek, it shows the complexity of particularly 19th century architecture, because during this middle of the 19th century, they were borrowing influences from all over the place. It's very attractive facade with a giant arch, which is more or less open, it's glazed, has a doorway, and on either side, what's known as blind arches. And it makes a very nice presentation. Along the roof line, there's a stepped parapet which conceals the edge of the gable roof, and we saw that for the first time in that 1872 bird's eye view depiction. Now, the high style that began to combine the Greek Doric columns, such as you see there on a fireproof building, and arches, was the rational neoclassical style, which came out of France, as you can derive from the name of the style, rational neoclassical. It was a development of the French Enlightenment, and rather quickly came to America and was introduced to Charleston by the Charleston architect Robert Mills, whose most famous structure, of course, is the Washington Monument in the national capital. Mills also introduced a Frenchy window treatment, the casement window, which was new to Charleston in the 1820s, because most buildings in Charleston before and after this period use the English tradition of the sash window, such as you see on the right there, which you find all over the city. Two mid-century photographs of the church showing that it's pretty well intact at that point in time, with the exception, if you look at the top of the central arch, the lunette there, the beautiful fan light, is covered over by vertical boarding. And in Charleston building history, that usually means that there was some storm damage at some point in time, which was dealt with makeshift repairs. And so that was the solution temporarily at that time. You also see the casement windows in the right photograph. They're actually operable, as are the casement windows of were operable. I know that they may have been painted shut by now. But the casement windows of the fireproof building also are operable. Fortunately, since sometime in the late 20th century, the lunette was restored. Don't know the details. I'd love to have some kind of documentation of what happened and how it was restored, etc. But we just don't have that documentation. And it provides light, of course, for the choir. St. Stephen's is similar to most Charleston churches. There are only a couple that don't have this feature. The galleries around three sides. And the gallery also provides space for the choir. Accessed by stairs, which are in the vestibule. Vestibule in the front. And traditionally, these were where the black people sat, slaves and free persons of color, some of whom also owned slaves. So it was an integrated church, but the white folks were here, the black folks up there. And here at the western end is the apse, which is a semicircular projection from the rear wall, which is of ancient origin as well. The Romans used it first in Roman basilicas. On the lower left, you see the floor plan of the Basilica of Maximus and Constantine, which stood in Rome. It's in ruins today, but that was the original plan, with the apse at one end, and that's where the magistrate sat when there was some kind of trial. And the Roman basilica was used for various purposes. And when the Christians began building churches, they patterned their churches initially after the Roman basilica. And so the apse became a standard feature in church architecture, and still is. This is the window here, which is depicted there, and the form of the apse is shown on that 1888 Sanborn insurance map on the right, which also shows that at that time, in the late 1880s, there was a two-story brick library building back there where the garden is today. That is long gone, of course, and replaced for practical purposes by the parish hall, which is, of course, modern architecture, but at the same time, you notice that the gable end is masked by the same type of stepped parapet as the main church. Then there's the cross. If you noticed on the earlier photographs, the cross was upright, but in 1989, Hurricane Hugo skewed the cross, and it's been like that ever since. And has it actually been replaced with the new cross? Okay. Right. But replaced with a cross that's skewed. It's a wooden cross, by the way. It's not metallic. But that's part of our heritage. Also, the parish has acquired and adjacent, you see how the lots come together on the Sanford map there, 54 Society Street for use as a larger parish hall space, offices, and also the rectory. So it's a multi-purpose building now, built in the 1850s by George Black, who was a bricklayer, a very prosperous bricklayer. He was among those Charleston craftsmen, master bricklayer, who, and the Hallbacks fit that pattern too. They had slaves, trained slaves, who actually did their work for them. That was the pattern in Charleston, and that was unique to Charleston, according to the historical accounts. He built the house for himself, and it's a rather elegant house in the Italianate style, articulated by coins along the front corners, and in the pediment at the top, a round-headed window. I'm personally very familiar with that garret because that was my first apartment in 1970 when the building was owned by Mr. What was his name? Brain cells are gone. Anyway, I had the whole garret, and the rent was the exorbitant amount, $75 a month. People told me I was foolish to pay such a high rent. That was 1970. Rents have progressed since then. Mr. Black stuccoed his brickwork, and you see in the photo on the left that part of the coining on the right side does double duty as part of the door surround, which I think was rather clever of him. And I haven't seen that particular element anyplace else. On the right, you see that the stucco has been incised or scored to look like stone block. That was a cheap way to make your building look more expensive. And you find it on many, many Charleston buildings, especially from the 19th century. And of course, the house had a long line of outbuildings in the back because George owned quite a number of slaves. And that line of outbuildings you see in the photograph only the northernmost part of the outbuilding has been repurposed in Charleston tradition of adaptive reuse as parish offices. And of course, St. Stephen's has received recognition for its architecture as well as its history. And our history continues. Do we have any questions?
So, would you call this a neoclassical building, or is it something else?
I'm sorry?
Is this a neoclassical building?
I can't.
He's asking, would you classify this as a neoclassical building?
Definitely neoclassical. It's, I would call it, you saw the image of the fireproof building, which is rational neoclassical, high style. And I would call this a vernacular version of that, vernacular version of rational neoclassical. Although, if you look around here, there's not a lot that's rational. It's not fireproof, for instance. Yes?
Do you have evidence in Charleston of the use of pattern books for buildings like this?
Oh, of course, yes. Starting in the colonial period, there were Charleston gentlemen who had pattern books in their libraries. And if you look around, you find direct references in the design of Charleston structures, which are derivative from pattern books. And one good example is 138 Wentworth Street. The Greek Revival house there. Many of the features are taken directly from Menard Lefebvre's, one of his books on Greek Revival architecture, including the doorway, which is almost exactly replicated from that. So yes, Charlestonians did use pattern books. Yes?
We've always been told that this was a free church. You didn't have to pay for pews here. Was that a rare thing? Was this, or were there many or a number of churches where anyone could go, or was this
No, it was very uncommon. The first St. Stephen's on Ginyard Street is said to be, and it might even be true, that it was the first Episcopal congregation that had free pews. You didn't have to rent a pew or buy a pew. And so it definitely was directed for less prosperous congregants. And that was pretty much the mindset of Sarah Russell, who also was one of the founders of the Ladies' Benevolent Society, which was the first organization in the United States, according to Charleston tradition, and it might even be true, to offer free nursing care to the poor, and also groceries. The nurses brought groceries. The volunteer nurses brought groceries with them. Yes?
Robert, thank you very much for coming, for a great talk. Is rational neoclassicism the same as...
Well, vernacular version, I hate to use the term watered down because it sounds so negative, but since it's a vernacular version of that high style. Any other questions?
I've seen old pictures with the chandelier, but earlier did they have gas lamps or how did they light the church?
I don't know. You'd have to delve into the parish records for that, which I don't have, have not had access to. But the gas works, Charleston Gas Works was established about 1940. So previous to that, they must have used candles. But eventually they probably had gas and eventually, surprise, surprise, electricity. Yes?
Speaking of gas and candles, how far back do the fire insurance maps go for Charleston?
The earliest one is 1788. Right. And they're still using fire insurance maps.
They're amazing.
Yes.
Was that library that was seen on the map that you showed us, was that over the cemetery? There was a cemetery on this site.
Well, I haven't seen any evidence of that cemetery. There aren't any headstones. So maybe that was a pauper cemetery as well to begin with. And it was chosen, I think, maybe because it was available and more capacious than the lot they had down on Ginyard Street. So that's my reckoning.
And one more thing, when you were in the garret in the 70s, do you remember walking by this church and seeing any activity at this church?
Yeah, I remember back in the early 70s, it was an entirely black church, and I remember things have changed since the 70s in Charleston. I remember the owner of the house next door complaining about the inward church, that somebody ought to buy this thing and close it down. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But that was the attitude. And that particular person has changed her spots since then. Yes.
Can you hear me? Am I projecting? I heard that there were stained glass windows in this church. Do you know anything about that?
I don't see any documentary or photographic evidence of that.
The older black ladies say it was before Hugo, that the stained glass was blown out during Hugo. Is that what everyone else is
It began to be integrated in the 1980s. And
but they were just saying that that's when the stained glass left, was Hugo.
I've seen no photographs of stained glass windows. If they existed, it was for a very brief time.
Isn't it really unusual for a church of this style to have stained glass windows? Usually they're clear, aren't they?
Well, you have to consider this was a chapel for the poor, and so they had a limited budget to begin with. And I think that's why this chancel window is not as tall as it should be.
Well, St. Joseph's is right out here. Looks a whole lot like this church, and it's full of stained glass. It's Lutheran.
And also sometimes
Excuse
the
me,
lights are just
what
colored
church is
rather
that?
than stained.
St. Jerome.
Oh, St. Johannes. Yeah. Maybe that's what they're thinking of.
No, they went to church here.
Yeah,
They talk about that it was dark glass and then
Was
after Hugo.
Stained glass?
Well, but not like stained glass, not like what we're thinking of, like sharp, but like just colored panes. That it was colored panes.
Okay, tinted glass.
Yeah, tinted, yes.
Okay. Well, The photographs that we have of the mid-20th century are black and white photographs. We don't have them in color. We don't have color photographs until recently. And so it's possible there was tinted glass, but definitely not stained glass. Stained glass would have been very expensive.
Plus, it probably would have been odd to have this window style with stained glass. You'd have a full pane.
What?
You wouldn't have a casement window with stained glass. You might have been painted or have tinted glass in the casement window.
Might have been tinted or painted, but definitely not stained glass.
Robert, you remember Don White?
Yes.
Okay. Don always told the story that it was the Tessel's window had the tinted glass, not these, and that they got blown out during Hugo, and they decided to put clear glass in the congregation. They were putting the windows back together. But that's all that I've ever heard was tinted was the front of the church.
Thank you.
Okay, well, all of that is new information
Don
to
White not
me.
only was our organist, but he was pretty much a historian too. He knew a lot about churches in Charleston.
Well, I remember that Don was quite a storyteller.
Yeah. He knew a lot.
So could you scroll back to those 1930s and 40s photographs?
You can't, yeah, they're just looking like regular. It'd be love to see the, I'd love to see the apps.
It does look like this might have been dark, but I mean, we don't have any side frontal photographs.
This building has always reminded me of the Roman triumphal arch
Uh-huh.
with the three arches. I've always thought of it as
Okay.
an American bastardization of the triumphal arch.
Well, is somebody writing a history of St. Stephen's? It's if so, it's past time to interview the older members.
Yeah.
Well, Adam did his,
That should take place anyway. That's part of the memory of this church.
Adam did his dissertation on the people of St. Stephen's, not the architecture necessarily. But our rector today did,
Michael, I can't hear you.
Robert, our present rector did his doctorate thesis on the people of St. Stephen's.
Okay.
As it was created, he did not do the architecture so much, but yeah, he's talked to a lot of the older.
Okay.
And actually, you might want to read that someday to enrich you even more.
Okay. Okay, well, that's good. That's good. Okay, any other questions about the architecture?